Story 1. A child I attended high school with was photographed at a protest. Someone warned his parents, and he was across the border without a passport before the police arrived at his house the next day to arrest him. Story 2. When the military shot unarmed protesters and covered up the blood on the roads with sand to hide their crimes. Story 3. When your friend in national security calls and tells you to drop everything, go to the airport, and buy the next ticket on the next departing flight, you either believe him or you do not. Story 4. When your neighbors suddenly start disappearing and everyone acts like they never existed. That is when you know it is time to pack before someone decides you have vanished too. Story 5. When Vladimir Putin was elected for the third time in direct violation of the Constitution, I kept telling my friends and family that we are officially a dictatorship and nothing good will come of it. But everyone said it was no big deal because everything had been fine so far. I am glad that I left back then. Story 6. This man wanted to amend the Constitution to remove term limits. He held a referendum, lost it, and then illegally held the same referendum again a few months later. The day the amendment passed, I called my aunt abroad and asked if she had a couch. She did. Story 7. This is the paraphrased culmination of something I was told by someone I worked with about 20 years ago, who escaped from Eastern Europe. It came out over 2 or 3 conversations. Everything was okay, not good, but okay. We had a little food, kept our heads down, and did not get involved with the police. Then one man down the road just disappeared one night, another the next, and the next. Heard about it, never saw it, never made an effort to see it. Then whole families were gone. The elderly were not so scared, whispering that the families had fled after the patriarchs were taken. But then you would see 1 or 2 other families doing really well, lots of food, new clothes, even bicycles. One day I was stopped by the police. I knew them, we grew up together, and they gave me some canned food and bread, asked who I knew was acting suspicious, anyone for any reason. It did not matter, even people I did not like. I convinced them I did not know anyone, but the next man they stopped, I knew him. He and my cousin, who were neighbors, were at odds because that man's dogs barked all night long. My cousin disappeared the next morning. I saw that man only once more before I ran. He was dressed in a new tracksuit and trainers. Scares me to read that back. The man was captured after he ran, beaten, then conscripted, before going absent without leave one day and finding his way to Germany. I believe he was from Montenegro. Story 8. When the news began to sound less like reporting and more like a government group chat. Story 9. When an annexation of a foreign land happened, the general attitude on the internet changed from opposing the government to supporting it and celebrating the annexation. Story 10. That's a really tricky one because often changes are so subtle you don't notice them, and then you don't want to or just can't leave because you have no means. I was always skeptical about politics. In my opinion, no politician is a good person, but I thought, well, what can we do? Then one notorious figure annexed a piece of land to our country. I was like, what? Is this really necessary? We already have a lot of land. All the news covered it as something peaceful and positive. My friends and family from this new territory were neutral or even positive about it, so my real concern was economic sanctions. Within a couple of months, I started to see the economy decline sharply, and I was a high school student at the time. At that point, I began thinking about leaving at some point in the future when I finished university, saved some money, and so on. The situation gradually worsened over the next 8 years. It was nicely covered up. People hardly talked about it, and if they did, they said it was a good thing. Then came protests and their dispersal by police. Then activists attacked and sometimes killed opposition leaders and journalists. Then politicians began to say that a war was going to happen and presented it as something good, telling people to be ready. Then the dismantling of opposition parties took place. Then COVID-19 was used as an excuse to forbid any mass gatherings, even though such gatherings are guaranteed by the Constitution. One day, my mom woke me up saying something like, "Looks like a war has started." This was a bit late in my opinion, but I finally got the hint, gathered everything I could in a backpack and a dog carrier. The only duffel bag I had was covered with a giant flag of my country, so I left it behind and left for good. Now I see that it is only getting worse. Freedom of speech is non-existent. The politicians who started the war get re-elected. Many people support this circus, though not everyone. We are at a point where the government forces its citizens to use only government-approved products and forbids books by untrustworthy authors. People are imprisoned for saying the wrong thing, and poverty forces men to go to war. Story 11. Race-related riot implicitly supported by the government. People were identified by census data, pulled out of their homes and set on fire. Story 12. They gave us a date to leave and said we would be killed after that date. My father got my mother, brother, and me out right away, as well as his widowed mother and disabled sister. He left on the last day. We lost our home, all our possessions, businesses, and more. Story 13. When my friend texted me that she could not meet me at the gym after work, because the newspaper where she was working had been seized over tax evasion. They had just published a double-page spread expose of corruption under the Recep Tayyip Erdogan regime. The following week, that newspaper spread was of wedding dresses for women who wear headscarves. In the intervening 18 years or so, that newspaper has been nothing but an Erdogan government gazette. Story 14. When a leader and their inner circle in government begin to make decisions that blatantly contradict the country's constitution, and they do so without being questioned by major media outlets, it becomes a serious issue. When people do speak out, their homes are raided by government police, trapping them in a legal process where they have no idea what is happening or how the case is progressing. It might seem obvious, but it is done with subtlety. If you do not realize what is happening in time, it feels like it is already too late to pack your things and leave. The moment I realized it was truly time to get out was when an acquaintance of mine was placed under investigation. For a long time, he had no access to his own case file or even to the charges against him. When he told me what was happening, I started to gather my belongings, reach out to some contacts, and left for Canada. Nearly 2 months later, I found out that this acquaintance had been arrested without due process, not even knowing why he was being imprisoned. Today, I am trying to bring my family here, but given the recent events in my home country, I see it is becoming increasingly difficult. Story 15. The grocery store had more framed photographs of the leader than actual groceries. Story 16. When propaganda starts replacing facts, that is the warning sign. Story 17. Almost 50 years ago, I was a student in Iran. I noticed religious groups spreading propaganda and conspiracy theories. Women started covering their heads. Uprisings at universities and martial law followed. Military takeover of cities happened next. I decided to leave. A year later, the Islamic Revolution occurred. I see many similarities with what is happening now in the United States. Story 18. When Vladimir Putin was elected for the first time, everyone with a drop of common sense understood where the country was heading. It was in 2000. I left for the United States. It wasn't easy. Now, if you are looking for a sign here in the United States, the first sign to me was back in 2004 when this country voted for a war criminal. Then there were so many signs I lost count. To name a few, Sarah Palin became governor of Alaska, all states adopted right-to-work laws, union membership dropped year over year, Citizens United decision, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's use of filibuster to deny anything to President Barack Obama, Tea Party activists, anti-vaccination movement. Facebook helped the Russian mafia manipulate the 2016 elections, Donald Trump, 2 failed impeachments, the Democratic National Committee electing Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders, Jeffrey Epstein, numerous wars that didn't threaten the United States but were fought with our money, the Supreme Court reversing 50 years of abortion protection, and the rise of religious ultraconservatives pushing their beliefs on everyone. The question was always the same. Where would you go leaving the United States? Where is that heaven on earth that is accepting to? Story 19. Not my story, but I know someone who lived under the crumbling Soviet Union. They were forced to flee when the Soviets started slaughtering civilians in a nearby town because the town wanted to withdraw from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviets were moving towards them. They showed me on Google Earth where they used to live. The land where their town and house once stood is now just rubble. The surrounding towns are being rebuilt, though. Story 20. My dad said he realized they had to leave when his history teacher disappeared and that he was going to be unable to keep his mouth shut. Story 21. When they try to push legislation to break encryption and read all your messages, it is unfortunate that this affects the entire European Union. Story 22. When people stopped arguing about politics and started whispering about it. Story 23. I gathered my visa paperwork together the day after a self-proclaimed dictator was elected to the most powerful position in my country. I am fortunate to have had the means and professional opportunity to leave. This was a plan that had long been in the works, but I acted after the election. Many of my fellow citizens who told me I was overreacting are now trying to leave because the self-proclaimed dictator has turned the country into a dictatorship. Story 24. When the government banned memes. If you are scared of memes, you have already lost. Story 25. I cannot speak for myself, but my ex fled Iran at 20 years old. She said the final straw was when one of her classmates was shot and killed by security forces during a demonstration. Story 26. When there was no real backlash against the president holding a violent insurrection attempt after he lost an election, it was only after he had already filled the Supreme Court with political sycophants. It was only a matter of time before he would take power again. Story 27. I never had to, but I would when I see that neighbors start disappearing overnight. Silence is louder than protests sometimes. Story 28. I would have left when Robert F. Kennedy started talking about making an autism registry. If I could afford to. Story 29. My grandparents fled Portugal during the Estado Novo era when they forced my pregnant great-aunt and her husband to relocate to Angola, which was a Portuguese colony at the time, in the middle of a war. My great-aunt was educated, which was very uncommon for rural women in Portugal then, and was slightly critical of the regime. My grandparents left illegally and immigrated to New Jersey in 1969. They have since obtained American citizenship and live comfortably now. Portugal is no longer a fascist state, so they returned for the summers. Story 30. Nothing. Authoritarian regimes are built on the foundation of underdevelopment. These conditions can persist for centuries. What I mean is this: Vladimir Putin can rob people in Vladivostok, and those in Moscow would have no idea. You cannot simply walk or drive from Vladivostok to Moscow, and even if you could, there is nowhere to stay along the way. People do not own large cars or recreational vehicles like in the West. In fact, few people own cars at all. Even if you manage the drive, you will find no infrastructure to support the journey. Russia also has a system of registration, a law that restricts migration to major cities. The population is not mobile. Meanwhile, all information online is easily controlled or manipulated. The news is fake, and everything people say in online forums is often just a reflection of the state-run media they consume. By the time people start getting killed, it is already too late. You can still escape with your life, but you will face major disadvantages in any new country. It takes years, even decades, to get an education and emigrate on your own terms. Sure, anyone can jump a border into the United States and survive, constantly looking over their shoulder, earning cash under the table. It is much harder to get an education, obtain a green card, and climb the socioeconomic ladder. After Vladimir Putin, there will likely be another time of troubles, and after that, another autocrat. You need to start preparing your exit before the next great terror begins. Story 31. They started building concentration camps, bullied countries and people, and were satisfied with it. Story 32. When criminals in plain clothes and unmarked vehicles started taking people off the streets. Story 33. When the United Kingdom government said the Department for Work and Pensions could read your personal emails, that was about 2016, if anyone can remember that far back. I am pretty sure it has been forgotten already. However, I came back when I realized the average person where I moved to, and in most places I visited, had it even worse. People will rightly say the United Kingdom has gotten even worse since then, but it is still one of the few places on Earth where it remains possible that such trends can be reversed. It is not over until the plus-sized person who can bear children sings. Story 34. When masked secret police began making people disappear. Story 35. A former colleague said he left Russia after witnessing what felt like a sudden shift from quiet discontent to widespread acceptance of Vladimir Putin following his third election in 2012. He drew unsettling parallels between that moment in Russia and the political climate in the United States today with Donald Trump, which is why he is planning to move to Germany soon. That conversation really did frighten me. Story 36. Trump got elected again, and I knew it was over. It was either buy a gun and start training for a meaningless last stand or leave, and my wife very firmly but fairly suggested the latter. I immediately gathered my passport and made plans to leave, which was great because it takes months. Even though I was a legal citizen of the United Kingdom, I was still in the country the day Elon made 2 Nazi salutes on stage at the inauguration party, and the media defended it. The week we left, Trump sent the National Guard to suppress dissent in California. I can't say I'm a fan of the new firearm license here with the same old think of the children excuse, but it feels more like Red China and less like Nazi Germany, so I'm not as worried about being rounded up and killed. Story 37. People's apathy and sense of compliance, along with frustration and gradual numbness, enable authoritarians to play the resistance game. Slowly, they take more and more, testing boundaries and desensitizing people. When you reach that level, authoritarianism is established. As an individual, no matter how much you love your country, the sense of self-preservation, your family, and future become a priority. Story 38. My friend's parents moved from Bangladesh to India in the 1970s. They were Hindus. At that time, there were rumors that the Pakistani army was kidnapping and killing Hindus and blaming them for the freedom struggle. One day, my friend's father went to see his crops near the boundary of another village. There he saw piles of bodies burning and women's corpses lying without clothes. Shocked, he ran back to his village and told everyone. The villagers immediately fled towards India with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. When they finally reached the Indian border, they learned that their village was the next target of the Pakistani army. Nearly 3 million people, mostly Hindus, were killed, and women were raped by the Pakistani army and its supported Islamist militia. This genocide was actively supported by the United States and other so-called Western democracies. When India intervened militarily to stop the killings in East Pakistan, the United States sent its 7th Fleet Aircraft Carrier Group towards the Bay of Bengal as a warning to India. However, the move was countered by the Soviet Union, which sent its nuclear submarine group into the Indian Ocean. This prevented any direct attack on India. Story 39. Lived in Myanmar. Protests were broken up by water cannons, then rubber bullets, followed by live ammunition and arrests at night. Phones were searched on the street. Story 40. I was buying cannabis at a head shop, and the clerk did not understand due process. America is in trouble. Story 41. We probably should have already left, but no other country wants us. Story 42. I wish I had left 20 years ago, before any of it was close to becoming what it is now. I am still hoping to make it out. Story 43. Half of the United States is living like this. Unfortunately, no one wants us or is willing to take us. Do not blame them. Maybe the black paint is to keep us in to be used as labor. Story 44. I think what is happening in the United States is a good example. If they are able to succeed in Texas redistricting, and in a similar way rig the presidential election, and put the most prominent opponent in prison with impunity, it is over. Then the long struggle to regain your voting rights begins, which would require a lot of sacrifice and years of rebuilding. Story 45. When you were discriminated against in employment, education, and healthcare, basic human rights, protesting against this was a guaranteed death sentence. It was a signal to leave. Story 46. Think about your potential destination first. Why is it going to be better? Just go to the best place you can because you can. What a positive message, right? Wrong. Everywhere is becoming infested with more extreme nationalists, mostly in the form of sycophants, cowards, and toadies, which all absolutely count. The hard work is not going away. Story 47. Medical care that I require to live is being openly debated as if it is a $7 Starbucks coffee I can simply choose not to buy. Additionally, blatant disinformation is being spread rapidly about it not being safe or effective, when science, major medical associations, and patients receiving the care all consider it to be completely safe, effective, and harmless. Story 48. The Shanghai lockdowns were strict. If they could enforce that so quickly, who knows what else they could do. Story 49. Recep Tayyip Erdogan winning an election after his corruption was proven. Story 50. Well, my former employer moved from the United States of America to Portugal in January. That does not sound like a bad idea. Story 51. They started to forbid many options without providing alternatives. That is the sign. Story 52. A friend of my family felt grief when they killed his father, who was a prominent scientist. Story 53. I left Russia 1 month before they invaded Ukraine. For a few years before that, I could see that the situation was getting worse, with new repressive laws being established and friends of friends being put in jail for peaceful protests. I did not anticipate that the war would start so soon, but I expected that something very bad was going to happen within a year or a few years. I had the luxury of leaving the country somewhat prepared, unlike many other people who fled it in February to March 2022, but still not being able to return to see some part of my family is very difficult. Story 54. When writing Palestinian action on a piece of cardboard could get you arrested. Story 55. We left the Soviet Union as soon as it was possible to leave. People who praise socialism and communism have no understanding. Story 56. When they elected George W. Bush a second time, my wife and I saw the writing on the wall. Story 57. Forced mobilization on the streets involved people being abducted, tortured, and sent to the front lines under-equipped and poorly trained after 2 weeks of basic training. Story 58. A friend of mine had her house attacked in Venezuela by the opposition political party when she was 7 years old. Her father was a reporter and had angered them. She and her mother fled to the United States after that. Story 59. When the only thing stronger than the propaganda was the faint smell of hair gel and spray tan in the air, I knew it was time to skedaddle faster than a member of the Republican Party dodging a climate change debate. Story 60. Oops, I made a comment here that was against the rules. Apologies. Story 61. None of you are going to leave. You like being told what to do and being led. You just act like you do not like it because you think that is what you are supposed to say. When I see more people in the world with original thought patterns, I will change my opinion. Story 62. I would rephrase this question. Dear Russian people still living in Russia, what signal are you waiting for? What are you still missing? I will create a new thread. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.